Just sit right back and you'll hear a tale of a fateful trip that started from this tropic point aboard this tiny ship. The mate was a mighty sailing man, skipper brave and sure. 5 passengers set sail that day for a 3-hour tour.
Hello and welcome to All the Games You Like Are Bad. I'm your very model of a modern Major General Mark Bigney, and today we're going to be talking about SeaFall. SeaFall is a legacy type game. Legacy games are ones that are characterized by decisions in one game having repercussions in all subsequent playings of that game. So, for example, as a result of an action you undertake, you might put a sticker on the game board, permanently altering what that part of the game board means for all future playthroughs of this game. New mechanisms might be introduced, the composition of card decks might be changed, and all manner of weird stuff may or may not happen, partially in response to the actions that players take. So, I think the best thing that can be said about SeaFall is that it is very ambitious. I think the most accurate thing that can be said about SeaFall is that it is aggressively mediocre. Let me first talk a little bit about components, because I think it's worth noting that legacy games live and die by their components. As I said, new mechanics get introduced, new things get put in. And so it's of the utmost importance that there be clarity and usability in all stages of this. Part of this is because the rulebook, when you start the game, cannot be comprehensive. It can't talk about everything, or at least it's perceived not to be able to talk about anything, because that would be spoilers and ruin the surprise of what's coming next. So it's unfortunate then that SeaFall, when it introduces new mechanics and new components, sometimes due to simple manufacturing and assembling errors, makes the experience a little more obtuse than it needs to be. For example, when you open up a box in SeaFall, it's supposed to have right at the top, read, paragraph, whatever, and that will tell you how to integrate the new components. However, on several occasions, this card wasn't immediately visible when I opened the box. It wasn't even immediately visible in the package of cards. I had to sift through the cards to find the thing to give me the instructions about how to proceed. That was unfortunate. It's also worth noting that some of the new rules mechanisms aren't explained with the level of clarity they're necessary because they don't even have a simple diagram about what the new cards look like. At one point, 2 new decks of cards got introduced into the game with different card backs, and the rules just made blithe references to the X deck and the Y deck, and I didn't know which was which. You had to paw through them and then make an educated guess about which way that it worked. It's also worth noting in terms of component issues, SeaFall has a number of minor graphic and functionability problems. Your ships keep falling over, which is super annoying, happens all the time. Come on guys, we know how to make plastic ships that don't fall over. This is kind of obnoxious. And some of the artwork looks like Ted in accounting or Janice from HR. I don't know if that's actually what happened. I don't know if these are actual drawings of people, but it looks like that, and it looks kind of cheesy and out of whack with everything else. But with those minor component issues out of sight, let me explain to you why I think SeaFall is a missed opportunity, and I'm going to start talking about the mechanics. The core mechanics of SeaFall are sailing around the map and doing endeavors. Now, sailing around the map is relatively straightforward, but often very tedious. You're going to spend some times where you're doing nothing but spinning your wheels, figuratively speaking, because the place where you want to get to is way over on the side of the map, and due to either poor planning on your part or just some random mishap that occurred to you, pull of the card, some other player being obnoxious, your ship sunk and you get to start all over again way back on the other side of the map. This isn't fun. It's tedious. And given the amount of downtime that's present in the game, it can be really frustrating to spend a lot of time just trying to get to the part where you can do something. And then when you get to do something, you do endeavors. Endeavors are the key way that you influence the game state in SeaFall, and it consists of building a pool of dice and rolling against a target number. Building the pool of dice is a bit of a chore. Even in very common, straightforward endeavor checks, you might be adding modifiers from as many as 4, 5, or 7 or 8 different sources. And this is reasonably straightforward, but the mental effort involved in doing this over and over and over again in a given game really starts to be grating. So you start with a pool of 4 dice. You add 1 from here, add 2 from there, add 1 from there, 2 from there, 1 from there, 1 from there, subtract 2 from here, subtract 1 from there. You do that 24 times over the course of the game, and it's really, really tiresome. The decisions you make to try to help build that pool of dice for future rolls, those can be reasonably interesting trade-offs in terms of resource management and risk-reward. But actually doing it, the thing that you keep doing over and over, very tiresome. It's kind of like the problem in Power Grid, where in a given turn in Power Grid, you might be asked to add 5 relatively small numbers together in your head over and over and over again. The transactions and the computations aren't particularly taxing or difficult, but keep doing them often enough and layer that on top of the actual decisions you need to make as a player, and it can start to get very tiresome, very frustrating, and very tedious. However, SeaFall doesn't just live or die based on its mechanics. SeaFall has a narrative and legacy elements on top of this. Let's talk about the narrative first. I was quite surprised to see that SeaFall was going to have a book of encounters, of paragraph encounters, where there's sort of story text guiding or informing what's going on in the game. This is something that was seen perhaps most prominently in a game called Tales of the Arabian Nights, which was driven primarily by this paragraph system, but it's been done in other games since and before to varying degrees of success. But let's talk about how it's handled in SeaFall. I think the way that it's done in SeaFall has two serious problems. One of them is in terms of the voice, and the other is in terms of the actual tone. The voice is a frustrating missed opportunity because 95+% of these paragraphs that you'll be reading are told by anonymous crew members reporting back to you, the player, who's nominally some sort of semi-feudal lord. They all sound the same, they're all nameless, they're all interchangeable, none of them matter, and as a result, the overall tone of the narration is just very samey and tedious. You don't care about these people, they don't have any personality, and it's not compelling writing. And so you spend a lot of time listening to other people read these paragraphs or reading them for yourself, and you just don't care about what's going on. Compounding this is a sort of fake old-timey English. You'll notice that the captain's book isn't a captain's book, it's a captain's bookie. This old-timey English is not rendered consistently or particularly well. The idiom overwhelmingly is modern English. The spelling is overwhelmingly modern English, but sometimes they just throw in an extra E, or maybe they double up a consonant here and there just to sort of get you into the mindset. Well, it doesn't get me into the mindset. When I read that, I don't think, ooh, this harkens back to the 17th century. What it tells me is that, ooh, this harkens back to a designer trying too hard. It's also worth noting that the book is written in a sort of florid, overly Baroque script, which serves to do nothing else than make it more difficult to read the passage aloud. So what with these spelling inconsistencies and the script, it can get rather difficult to just interface with the paragraphs. And then there's the tone of what's actually being discussed. So the designer, Rob Daviau, in his designer diary, said that he wanted the game to be Indiana Jones in the Age of Sail. And he said specifically that, with respect to the Age of Sail, that he wanted the tone to be one of unreconstructed colonialism. And that's fine. I think it's perfectly morally acceptable to tell a story about unreconstructed colonialist jerks who don't care about the savages that they're dealing with, about how uncivilized they are, and how their culture is uninteresting and unimportant. And that's very much the tone of the paragraphs. Your sailors disembark from their ship, they land on these islands that they've either discovered or already knew about, and they're talking about, oh, look at these savages, they don't know what they're doing, they're so stupid and uncivilized, let's just, use them as cannon fodder or something. This happens over and over and over again. And that's, it's okay, so they're racist, colonialist jerkwads. But the problem is that the story that you get, because the story is being told by these racist colonialist jerkwads, is incredibly dull. There were a couple of paragraphs early on in the game, even in our first and second playings, where they would make some vague reference to some cultural practice that the natives were involved in. And my immediate response was, that sounds fascinating. Is there going to be any payoff? Are we going to learn more about this? The answer to a large extent is no, because the people telling the story, the people recounting the events to you, don't give a crap about the practices of the savages. So you don't get any culture, you don't get any local flavor, you just get a whole bunch of European-ish ship dudes stealing a whole bunch of wood from natives. And that's okay as a game, don't get me wrong, but it's such a boring story for most of the time. When there's any narrative payoff, it comes very, very late in the game, and it's only when the colonialists care about them, the colonialists, and what they're doing. The entire other elements of the game, any sense of wonder or exploration or discovery of new things, is very much undercut by the fact that the narrators don't care about what they're seeing most of the time. And what I, as a player, find interesting and wondrous and potentially beautiful, they find savage and uninteresting and dull. Another game that had an element of paragraph narration to add flavor to what was going on was a game called Above and Below, which was released relatively recently. And I played Above and Below 2 times. I played SeaFall throughout the entire campaign, and I can remember more instances of genuine wonder and interesting excitement through the paragraphs and above and below than I did in SeaFall, precisely because these new denizens that you're meeting, these new creatures, these new cultures, are presented as being interesting and wonderful because the narrator in that game sees them as such. SeaFall doesn't do that, and so it completely closes itself off from that possibility. I don't think Above and Below was a particularly good game, but at least the narration was much more interesting. As to the other claim of the designer, remember he said Indiana Jones and the Age of Sail. I think he misses the Indiana Jones at the expense of the Age of Sail, because Indiana Jones, when he gets a gold idol from a culture, doesn't, and someone says, what does this idol mean? His answer is not, I don't know, melt it down for gold, which was basically the attitude of the overwhelming majority of the paragraphs in SeaFall. Tremendous missed opportunity and uninteresting and dull. Now, I don't think that this whole paragraph system works very well in games that have a lot of, Euro-style management or whatever, because most of the time, if you're not engaged in the story, it's just more downtime, and there's a lot of downtime in SeaFall, especially when you're in one of those situations where you're just going to be, moving 3 spaces for your action, and you can't really do much else. Sitting around for a long time while everyone else does their turn and reads this overlong, boring story about, hey, this site produces wood, or hey, this site is a mine, or hey, whatever, is not particularly engaging. And then you just do your 2-second action, have your ship fall over, write it up, and say, all right, next up. And there are a lot of turns like this, unfortunately. It's helps contribute to the overall feeling of tedium. Now, it may sound that I'm a jaded gamer and I don't care for all the new innovations that legacy elements can introduce. Now, to a certain extent, that may be true, but it is worth noting that when a game does something genuinely new, I really do get excited, and perhaps all the more excited because it's new and I've played so many other types of games. An example of this is Time Stories. Time Stories is a game that I don't much enjoy, but I had a couple of moments when playing at least the base adventure that comes in the base box of genuine excitement about what it was doing with components, about how it opened up the narrative and gameplay space by doing novel things with even just cards. And so when those moments of excitement happen, I think they're really worth rewarding. And SeaFall does actually do this very late in the game. You're going to spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours just shuttling back and forth, doing these endeavors and tediously adding up modifiers before, or at least I did, before I got my first sense of genuine wonder, where I opened up a box and saw the new components and said, they're doing something really interesting here. I can't wait to see how this pans out. Let me get these hands on these new components. The rest of the time, it was just, oh, here's another new sub-mechanism that relies on the silly Endeavor mechanic. Or, oh, here's another set of modifiers that we can add to the Endeavor mechanic as our target numbers get ever and ever higher. Or here's just more stuff to throw into the system, more grist for the mill. And by then, it was just too little too late. And when the new stuff came that I found genuinely interesting, it was just buried under a sea of other mechanics. By that point, we had so many other sub-mechanisms that the new thing that happened was just a tiny proportion of what we were actually doing with ourselves. And couple that with the downtime, and it was too little too late. It didn't save the game for me. I don't know if there are solutions to this. I think the game definitely needed to have been pared down in a lot of ways. Maybe this really cool thing needed to be introduced a little bit earlier. Maybe the overall length of the game needed to be shorter, so there were fewer cycles, and so the game felt more fresh each time. I don't know, but at the end of the day, I think that this is a wasted opportunity, and it's a shame that the genuinely good stuff that SeaFall introduces very, very late in the campaign is going to be missed or not enjoyed by a lot of people who I think are going to be turned off by the early parts, the early game sessions. I don't really think it's worth soldiering through all those game sessions just to get to that good stuff. Honestly, I think it's a bad calculation, and it's burying the lead. So let's talk about this in the overall scope of legacy games, if you've played any of the other ones, just for reference. The first legacy game was Risk Legacy, and it had the benefit of being first, obviously, and it also had the benefit, I think, actually, of being a game design that everyone was familiar with, but at the same time, no one's super enthusiastic about. And as a result, it often became just sort of a group game design element, where you try to make Oceania less powerful, you try to make Asia more worthwhile, you try to balance the game, and honestly, that was fun. I found that to be a rather interesting experience. And you get to try new things in this relatively tired Risk formula. And so even though the game design wasn't very solid, the underlying Risk engine is problematic, as everyone knows, I had a great time with it. And the legacy elements were great. There were a number of boxes where you open it up and say, I can't believe they're doing this. This is wonderful. And it had serious impact, and there was serious wonder. The next legacy game was Pandemic Legacy. And I actually didn't like Pandemic Legacy all that much. I prefer just a base game of Pandemic with On the Brink added in. I think that has more variety and interest than the game of Pandemic Legacy. Because there were two serious problems, I think, with the way the legacy elements were handled in Pandemic. Number one, they were introduced on a fixed schedule. Game 1, you play with this. Game 2, you play with this. Game 3, you play with this. And that undermined the sense of, players controlling how the world gets shaped. Compounded with the fact that in Pandemic, the disease elements are handled by this randomized deck, and so you didn't really feel like you were crafting a world. You felt that you were reacting to what a world was throwing at you. It's also worth noting, the second problem I had with Pandemic is I didn't really have any of those holy crap, look at what they're doing moments when opening up any of the components in Pandemic Legacy. A lot of the things they introduced were just things that were present in expansions. Mild spoiler, my apologies. And a lot of the other stuff I just didn't find all that compelling. I opened up and said, oh really, you're doing this? Okay, fine, whatever. And that's unfortunate. Also missed opportunity. And now we have SeaFall. SeaFall is a game which I think the fundamental design is pretty mediocre and unsatisfying. And all the legacy elements are not particularly good until they become amazing, which is weird. And it's also worth noting that SeaFall continues an unfortunate trend in the legacy design space. Risk Legacy was very clear that any number of people could play the game, and you could play the game with whomever. It doesn't matter whether this is game 2 or game 10. You can play with people who've played before or who haven't played before. Go ahead, go crazy. Pandemic Legacy said you could do the same thing, but really you should sort of try to stick with the same people, and there was the sense of ownership over characters to a certain extent, and so it kind of led you toward the direction of maintaining a consistent group. I didn't, but whatever. SeaFall now has gone yet even further in that direction, where there's the solid expectation that you're always going to be playing with the same people. This is a long game that in order to complete the campaign, you'll have to play many times, on average 15, they say, and that sounds about right. That's a lot of time. That's a serious social commitment to always play with the same people. There are serious disincentives to playing with new people, and there are serious disincentives for missing a game. Your standing in the campaign is going to be seriously negatively impacted. And this, I think, is unfortunate. I really appreciate it when a game is as flexible as possible. Don't make playing a board game to be a tremendous social chore that I have to schedule in advance. There were benefits with playing with the same people in Risk Legacy from a social perspective, so there was already enough inducement to play with the same people. But you didn't have to. The game didn't hit you over the head for having missed a game or for having introduced a new player. I really don't like it when legacy games do that. Please don't do that in the future. Please reverse this trend for any future legacy designs. Especially since SeaFall is aggressively unfriendly to new players. If you introduce a new player around about game 5 or 6, the rules explanation is going to take 2 years, because the core mechanics may be relatively simple, but they've been layered every time something new has happened, a new layer of complexity has been added on. So this is how an endeavor works. But there are 20 different kinds of endeavors, and for this you need this target number, and you're trying to get this many successes, and for this other thing you need this other target number, and this many successes modified by these other things. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It wasn't particularly pleasant for me as a repeat player, but for a new player, it would get pretty nightmarish pretty quickly. And I still had to consult the rulebook all the time to find all these modifiers. And you can't make a player aid because any player aid would be spoilers, so the tedium is only enhanced for anyone that's being introduced to the system for the first time. So what are some alternatives? Let me try to situate it now more broadly in terms of game design. If you want Age of Sail, you are extremely well served by the market. There are so many good Age of Sail games, some with conflict, some without, some with market mechanics, whether you want pick up deliver or to fight people, whatever. Let me just name 2. Merchants and Marauders is very popular, and it's the sort of, you can go buy and sell goods, or you can shoot the crap out of your friends style of game that many people like. And there is a kind of emerging narrative over the course of a game of Merchants and Marauders that's not presented through overbearing, faux, old-timey text in a narrative book. Sorry, bookie. Or If you want a more Euro experience that focuses more on the market of things, and you don't kill people, but you still sail around and find stuff, allow me to recommend the excellent Ghidorah. It's a great game of going and building buildings and getting goods from the new world, to us anyway, and selling them and trying to leverage economic positions. It's a great game. And if you really want the Age of Sail, there's any number of designs that can keep you happy. If you want to tell a good story, if you want to get engrossed in a narrative, and if you want to feel that your actions have genuine impact, well then, play any adventure game that has been released in the past few years, because it's definitely the standard now that they should all have some sort of overarching narrative or character progression system. I mean, hell, a recent game called Grimslinger is a relatively straightforward card dueling game, and even it has a narrative, RPG, leveling up, permanent game state element to it. And there are a whole bunch more coming down the pipe. So there's plenty of ways to get your sort of narrative and upgrade juices flowing in this current market. You really are spoiled for choice. And if you want to tell a really good story, play a Game Masterless RPG. There are tons. Fiasco is a great game. Durance is my personal favorite. There are ways to do this without sort of trying to get a story element into basically what is a Euro management game with elements of combat. More and more, I find this effort, like Above and Below, to shoehorn in these narrative books into basically resource management games. And for my taste, it's not so much chocolate in your peanut butter as it is toothpaste in your orange juice. And if I want to tell a good story, I will consume some good media that tells a good story, or I'll craft a good story with my friends playing a narrative RPG. But if I want to play a board game, I'm going to play a board game that plays to the strengths of a board game and doesn't layer me under the tedium of a bad story read by somebody else or additional mechanics just because I want to extract some wood. I don't want to say that there's no possible merger of the two things, but for my taste, it's far better that when a board game tells a story, it is an emergent story that is based on well-crafted mechanisms that are evocative of a theme, rather than a bunch of shoddy mechanisms with a bunch of writing thrown on top of it. That's not, I think, the design you want to go. But, I mean, who knows? Maybe you're obsessed with stickers. Maybe the act of pasting a sticker onto a board fills you with such tremendous joy that you think SeaFall is the best thing ever. If so, more power to you. I think you're wrong, but I forgive you. Thanks very much, and take care.